Well, as you put out in your notification, I want to look at certain fiscal and financial issues, fiscal, monetary, and financial issues, which arise in the context of the effort to address this the COVID-induced crisis that we are in the midst of. We have to, of course, remember, as I think, as we mentioned many times, including in yesterday's lecture, in this series, that well before the COVID crisis hit, the global economy in general, and of course the Indian economy, was already in the midst of a downturn. There was a recession. There was a demand compression as far as many industries were concerned, and already the government was involved in ostensibly efforts to try and pull the economy out of the recession. Though, of course, in the Indian case, the principal form this response took was, of course, providing a huge concession to corporates, which brought down the effective rate of corporate tax to about 22%, involving revenues foregone over a whole year, which was close to 150,000 crores, 150,000 crores. So there was, in some sense, in the midst of what was a downturn demand compression, there was a handout, which in some sense undermined the ability of the state to undertake significant expenditures, because the whole idea was that you would try and incentivize the private sector to spend and undertake investments by demand compression. So we already were in a situation where we had partly given in as far as the game was concerned, and that was when the intensification of the crisis, because of the specific sort of exogenous impact of the COVID pandemic, took effect. Many of the issues I'd be raising are, in fact, issues which concern all economies across the globe, which are affected by this crisis. But I'll be using specifically the Indian case in order to allow me to a certain extent, simplify, and because possibly the audience would be largely those who are a little more familiar with the Indian case. Now, we know that when capitalist economies are in the middle of a crisis, typically it takes the form of contraction of production, which of course places workers from the workplace, results in a increase in unemployment, and therefore intensifies the contraction because of the adverse demand effects of the loss of livelihoods and incomes, which result from the sort of unfolding of the crisis. Conventionally, as part of the way in which cycles in capitalist economies or recessions or even the Great Depression was analyzed, the problem was seen specifically as being a result of a collapse of demand, of a compression or a serious compression in demand, which comes because of a host of factors which I'm not going to go into just now. And the whole idea was that you needed an agency or a set of players or actors who could step in and go counter to the trend as far as the cycle is concerned and revive demand. And normally it was expected that it would be the state who do this, because of the fact that the degree to which the actions of the state can be independent of or autonomous in some sense, relative to what is happening in the economy, where it is in a position to be able to spend, normally borrow and spend, in a situation when you're in the midst of such a downturn, allows the infusion of demand into the system. And that infusion of demand, of course, can, under different circumstances, begin to revive the economy. Though, of course, it's not automatic and necessarily true, but that is the understanding when you are in a situation of a typical demand compression. But of course, contraction of demand in capitalist economies can occur also because of the fact that a supply-side shock, and supply-side shocks can be of various kinds. Supply-side shocks could be because of tsunamis, because of hurricanes. It could be because of just plain bad monsoons resulting in a contraction in agricultural output, which affects the incomes of farmers and wage earners in the rural areas. So there could be multiple factors which work themselves through in a situation of some kind of what could be seen as an exogenous supply side shock. And that, of course, could, over a period of time, and as much as it displaces a set of people from the activities they are normally engaged in and therefore affects their incomes, could also contribute to a shrinking of demand in certain areas. The aspect of supply side shocks, of course, is that they, just as much as many of the crises under capitalism, that they tend to be, in many cases, restricted to certain countries or regions for certain periods of time. And therefore, you actually have a situation in which the shortfall in supply, which results as a result of the supply side shock, is something which can be made up by accessing supplies from other regions or accessing supplies through trade from abroad. And of course, you can try and therefore revive the economy in the interim by utilizing supplies from elsewhere till such point of time as you're able to restore activity in these regions once the effect of the exogenous shock is gone through. And really, what you need in that kind of a situation is not merely an attempt at revival, at stalling and reversing the downturn and reviving the economy, but also ensuring that as this occurs, that the elements contributing to the supply side shock and their effects are in some sense addressed as a part of the package that you put in place. Now, the feature, of course, of the COVID-induced crisis, which has been noted universally, is, of course, firstly, that given the globalized nature of the world economy we are in, given the rapidity with which the infection can spread, we've ended up with a situation in which the shock, the pandemic, is something which has become a pandemic. It's across the world. It's not restricted to a few countries, a few regions. And more importantly, this is resulting because of the inability to address the health emergency immediately in ways other than resorting to mechanisms like social distancing combined with testing, tracing, isolation, and of course ramping up medical facilities in order to deal with that proportion of the cases which are more than mildly ill, which are moderately ill or seriously ill, require ventilator support. You need to ramp up your facilities, undertake significant expenditures, and of course look to ways in which in the medium or long term you're in a position to be able to try and suppress the pandemic in some form. Now, this obviously means that the very nature of the ways in which you address the COVID pandemic actually contributes to the sudden stop in production and supply. So it's really that there is this huge displacement which occurs of people from their activities, partly because those activities cannot take place. And this is quite generalized. It's only in areas where the state is able, in some sense, to ring-fence economic activity and keep it going, despite the requirements of social distancing, isolation, and in more severe cases, of course, containment or a total lockdown of the kind that has been imposed across the country in India. And this obviously means that you're going to have across the globe a situation in which you have a sudden stop to productive activity, except in certain essential areas where too a combination of reduced activity and difficulties of transportation and distribution would over a period of time result in a situation where activity cannot be at levels required to ensure adequate availability. So you're basically talking about a situation where the sudden stop results in a very large number of people losing out on the kind of incomes that they earn, whether those incomes be wage incomes, earnings of the self-employed or informal sector workers, workers in activities which are not able to sustain regular payments, including in some sections of the corporate sector and so on. So you have a combination of a sudden stop in supply as well as a huge demand compression. It obviously means that the effort that you need to address this kind of a crisis is far more, has to be far more intense and far more widespread and large, much larger than what would be the case even in a normal capitalist crisis of some intensity. So therefore, you're basically saying that we are talking about a situation in which it's clear that in order to address the health emergency, in order to be able to undertake those activities such as testing, tracing, isolation, ramping up medical facilities, protecting your health workers, looking for a vaccine, looking for temporary sort of ways of addressing the health problem, etc., requires a large amount of spending. There's a large amount of spending which would be required in order to be able to provide to those who displaced from economic activity, do not have income, cannot access essentials required for them to survive. And therefore, you need to be able to make transfers both in kind and cash to this set of people. And finally, of course, you need to ensure that at least those segments of those agents, those economic agents, who now are not able to undertake the activity and will not be able to undertake activity for a certain period of time, would be in a position to stay afloat, such that as and when the economy is in a position to be able to begin, having stalled the downturn, begin to reverse it, and then register some kind of a revival or recovery, would be in a position to be able to come back. Otherwise, you're going to have the crisis turning out to be extremely prolonged, because those who would be necessary to be able to, in some sense, implement or mediate the recovery through their activities would not be in a position to be able to come back. And this might require, besides subsidies, low interest loans, perhaps in certain cases in the MSME sector, actual financial support, and so on. You actually would need, across this range of activities, a huge infusion of finance into the system in order to be able to allow them to begin to, in some sense, continue their activities or survive, continue their activities, and of course, for the demand to revive such that you're in a position to be able to get back to activity. And in this, you have to do it in a way in which you're in a position over a period of time to allow activities to begin, to ring fence them, and they can be undertaken despite the fact that the nature of the health emergency is such that it's difficult to put in place a range of economic activities without the possibility of a rise in the level of infection. And therefore, it requires special effort. Now, put all of this together, and basically what you're saying is that there is far more than conventional crises, far more than normal supply side shocks, far more than are required even in situations of serious recession or mild or serious depressions. You possibly would need, in the current context, not just in this country, but across the world, large degree of infusion of expenditures, which would need to be allocated in this form. On the one hand, to cut the losses, to take over the burden of the losses, and on the other hand, to try and ensure that activity revives and the demand to sustain those activities revive. Now, it's not surprisingly, therefore, across the world, including in countries which were quite averse till quite recently to undertake sort of significant autonomous expenditures, the state has had to come in, because it's very clear that in situations of crisis, generally under capitalism, and of course in a crisis of this kind, it's not possible for the private sector to take on the responsibility of reviving. It's looking to the state. So it must be the state which is in some sense in a position to be able to undertake this activity. And of course, in countries which are more federal in their structure, countries with the state and provincial governments, whether it be the United States or India or elsewhere, this would be necessary on the part of provincial governments and state governments as well, because very often that they are the front in the battle against the pandemic, with a centralized government not being in a position to be able to do very much on the ground to address the kind of problems which would arise in this context. But of course, it must play a role in mobilizing and transferring the resources needed to undertake this activity. Now, the point is, of course, what would be the level of spending which is required? And this is something which is extremely difficult to estimate because of the fact that we are not just talking about, let's say, some humanitarian support. people have suggested something like 7,500 rupees per month for at least three months or a little more to be provided universally to those who need it. Something like 10 kgs of free rice or wheat being made available every month to these sections, and of course some to be able to ensure supplies which are crucial or essential for them to be able to survive and remain in place, as it were, till such point of time as the recovery happens. So it's extremely difficult. And then, of course, then you need to ensure that activities and those who are going to undertake activities stay afloat. You need to ensure that the supply side shock is in some sense addressed, the ring fencing takes place, and so on and so forth. So it's extremely difficult to make an estimate. But I mean, estimates would say that even the humanitarian support over a 3-month period might require something like 3% of GDP at the national level. Or if you take, for example, a state which in some sense was the most prepared to address this kind of a crisis, the state of Kerala. Kerala had the experience with the Nipah virus. It has a much more decentralized system of managing public health issues, which allows it to be able to prepare and plan. It did recognize the possibility that the Wuhan crisis would affect it very soon, particularly because its students were there from Kerala in Wuhan, and began to prepare itself. And if we look at the preliminary estimate that they have made of what would be required for a package over a single year, this range of activities, they made an estimate of something like 20,000 crores is the package that they've announced. Now, 20,000 crores for a state like Kerala is about 2.5% of its GDP, and it's about 16% of its total budgetary expenditure in a year. So we are saying that it needs a huge amount of additional spending. Now, already it's a state which is at the maximum of what is now considered permissible for state governments to borrow and spend, which is the fiscal deficit. It has a fiscal deficit already of about 3%. So if you add on another 2.5% or more, let's say another 3%, you're talking about the need for it to go to a fiscal deficit of 6%. And that's a state which in some sense is a little more prepared. Other states, if they actually begin to do and implement what needs to be done to address this, would possibly have to be further down the line, not just at 5% or 6% or higher. So we're really talking about the possibility that nationally, I mean, we could be going to 10 or even more if you want to do it well, but at least if you want to do something, to be able to address it in some fashion, you definitely are well above the 5% range of GDP in order to be able to get this thing addressed as additional spending. Now, obviously, the question comes up, so how do we get this money? How does the center get this money? How much does it transfer to the states? And how do the states add to that by actually going and mobilizing money of their own? Of course, at the moment, we know that the center has only announced one package of any significance, and that package is less than 1% of GDP, despite the fact that it has a large amount of physical resources, in particular food in stock, in excess of 70 lakh tons, which is more than 3 times of what is required as a buffer to deal with the normal requirements. We actually see that the effort to try and move this grain in order to be able to address the problems of the large number of people who are looking for food, are malnourished, or some dying of starvation, and so on and so forth, that you don't see that. But in essence, what you're saying is, if it was going to happen, this less than 1% of GDP is nothing. You're really talking about getting to between, as I said, 5 to 10% of GDP. Now, the point is, one way in which governments have, particularly after liberalization, tried to mobilize money is to go and issue bonds in the market. Of course, when you issue bonds in the market, you're essentially saying that whoever buys these bonds, whether it be for investors to the extent that they are within the ceiling and can buy them, or banks or other financial institutions or high net worth individuals, who it may be, when they go and buy, or mutual funds, when they go and buy these bonds, they're obviously looking at the possibility of the agency which is actually putting these bonds into the market being in a position to be able to service this debt. And servicing this debt obviously means you pay interest and you have to meet the capital cost, the amortization. You have to pay back the capital in installments or finally at maturity. And what you actually have is a situation in which most across the country, you're actually seeing a collapse in government revenues. Some states have actually said that in April, they got less than 1/10 of the revenues they got in the same month last year, in April 2019. That's the kind, it's a fall from 3,000 plus crores to 320 crores, something like that in one state. You're actually seeing a complete collapse of revenue generation. And part of the reason you're having this collapse in revenue generation is because you're falling into this trough. So basically is that to get out of where you are, you need to have large amounts of money to spend. But because of the fact that you're not spending large amounts of money, you're actually having less money to spend because your revenues are collapsing. In a situation like that, obviously, normal investors would say that the risk associated with despite the implicit or explicit sovereign guarantee associated with borrowing from the state government, borrowing by the state governments, and of course, sovereign guarantee at the national level for the center, there is a certain risk involved. There is a risk premium which has to be attached to that borrowing. And therefore, we find that when states, for example, go to the market, because they are the ones who are now actually undertaking expenditures of any significance. When Kerala went to the market and bought much more than many other states because it's announced this large package, it ended up reaching a situation where it had to pay anywhere close to 9% interest on the borrowings it had to make as it expanded the volume of borrowing. And if you borrow at 9% in a situation of this kind, when your revenues are collapsing, that's actually, it's not merely a reflection of the fact that there's a huge risk premium which the investor is attaching to the loans or the bonds he's buying from you, but you are also, and these bonds are optioned by the Reserve Bank of India, okay, in the market. And it also means that there is actually a possibility of default unless there is some solution which is found, which is outside this market-mediated solution of going to the market and issuing bonds and borrowing to undertake the kind of expenditures that you would need to undertake, or somewhere near the kind of expenditures that you would need to undertake. Now, the question is that what else can be done? And of course, what can be done is that the state does not only consist of government, the state also includes the central bank. And through the central bank, the state has the right of note issue. It's in a position to be able to, in some sense, create money in order to undertake expenditures because of the fact that this is a very unusual situation. And it will have to, in the medium term and long term, find ways in which it can then pay back to the extent necessary the loans which it has incurred. Now, this, of course, also has to be at lower rates of interest. So if you say that the state governments should be allowed to borrow from the Reserve Bank of India, the Reserve Bank of India should buy up state bonds. It should buy up state bonds at the maximum at the repo rate, which has now been reduced as part of the central bank's effort, because the effort of dealing with the pandemic seems to have fallen on the central bank other than on the central government. And therefore, you would say that you would say that the least is that it would have to lend at the repo rate, which is currently about 4.4%. But possibly there should be some mechanism by which a part of this interest, there's a subvention, there's a subsidy which is provided to the state, so that the states are able to borrow at even lower rates of interest. This is not completely unusual. What you have in the United States is an extreme example where the Federal Reserve is buying up any kind of paper in the market, not just government paper, but also corporate bonds and paper issued by financial institutions, buying it up at near zero interest rate because of the fact that you want to keep the financial system viable and going, besides doing other things. It has announced a 2 trillion and now more stimulus package. Of course, a significant chunk of that goes to the corporate sector, but there's a significant part which also goes in the form of transfers, income transfers, in the form of spending on the health emergency, and in the form of unemployment benefits for a large and expanding unemployed labor force over the last couple of months. So the point is borrowing from the central bank in situations like this. People would say even in other situations, but definitely in situations like this, and borrowing for which the interest rate is kept low is the way to go, because there is no other agency would be in a position to be able to pick up these bonds, if at all they are picked up, at interest rates which can make sense to agencies which are actually dealing with a national crisis on behalf of everybody. Now, the issue which has come up is that people say that, listen, it could be dangerous because of the fact that it can lead to moral hazard. It could lead to indiscipline in spending, and of course, it could lead to inflation. And that's the reason we had the FRBM Act. And once we have FRBM Acts at the central level and at the states, which prescribes a time path for the level of the fiscal deficit, you're not in a position to be able to do it, because not only are you going to go and borrow more, but you're going to actually have a monetized deficit, which in the mid-1990s itself, India had gone back on as part of financial liberalization. So this is something which is part of the old world, and it's not something which you can do. And therefore, legally, this is not a possibility today, in which case the question is, if the state, by error, has tied its hands in a way in which it can't address an emergency of this kind, then obviously it's time to decide, since it has the power to do so, to actually release itself from these bonds, and actually say that we should go back on the FRBM Act, not just use some escape clause, but even at the state level, give the states considerable flexibility. Besides giving them transfers, besides giving them the compensation for lost revenues, also give them the flexibility to be able, depending upon the effort they make, to go out there and borrow from the central bank at relatively low rates of interest, as close to zero as possible. The other thing which, of course, it said is that this could lead to inflation. Now, of course, normally when we speak of supply side constraints which matter, when there's a sudden surge in spending in the economy, in this case, spending financed by borrowing, the constraint which asserts itself is principally the wage goods constraint. Agriculture is a sector which cannot adjust quickly. Immediately, if people receive transfers and so on, that they would go out and spend, and therefore that would be the area which would bother you most. Now, at least as far as the core element of that is concerned, as far as the food required to meet the demands which would come is concerned, not only do you have the supplies, in any case, a part of the package that you have to think of is to provide these supplies at free to the majority of the population. And therefore, there's no question of this money actually going to go and hit a food grains constraint. But of course, it is true that in other areas, especially given the sudden stop in economic activity, what you would need is to, along with the decision to undertake spending, is to plan to be able to actually use the unutilized capacities, put in place activities like production of vegetables and other products, put in place mechanisms where you can actually allow for the use of capacities which are already there. It's not that these capacities are not there, it's just that the effects of the pandemic have resulted in sudden stop. So part of the spending, which is going to be financed by that, is actually going to relax the supply side constraint. So you're really not talking about the fact that you necessarily would have inflation. The sort of the conditions in terms of the asset position of the economy is one in which it can handle this additional spending. It's only the sudden stop in terms of the use of those assets which is a problem. And part of the spending should be geared to actually generating the revival of those activities such that supply can increase. And when supply increases, obviously, it would also it would increase employment. And when it reduces employment, it would reduce the need to allocate resources in order to actually benefit those who currently have to be transfers because of the fact that they don't have any means of livelihood. So therefore, this is, I think this is something which is exaggerated, is manageable, And therefore, the question arises, when across the world, governments are just giving up on this whole idea that we need to not spend on the basis of borrowing, why is it that in some countries, in particular India, which is the case I'm focusing on, why is it that we are having a situation when this route is not being taken? And the real reason I think that this route is not being taken consists of, there are two real reasons. One reason is quite obvious, and I think there's evidence to support it. And that is that if you actually launch on that strategy today as being the immediate way in which you address the immediate crisis, it is inevitable that in the medium term, these government, including the state governments, but particularly the central government, which has the powers of taxation at hand, would have to use those powers of taxation, particularly the power to tax wealth, given the huge amount of inequality in this country, to generate the surpluses in order to meet whatever commitments it has to write down that debt which it has incurred during this period. And partly, of course, it would benefit from the revival of economic activity where revenues would increase in any case, but it would need more than that. It would need to undertake this additional taxation. And if it has to undertake this additional taxation, obviously, there would be forces which possibly would be sensitive to the fact that if the government decides to get proactive and deal with the crisis that it has, the way it has to be dealt with, there would necessarily have to be a turn to a more egalitarian redistributive fiscal policy in order to generate the revenues to pay for the debt, even at the lower subsidized rate at which it is incurred, and clear that debt sometime in the medium term and the long term. And that obviously is going to generate opposition, both ideologically within the state and from outside, because of the fact that those who have these surpluses would like to protect them. But in some sense, what we're saying is that this crisis is a crisis in which not merely are governments being challenged to come out and show their ability to be able to address it, but the only way they can address it is a way in which finally, financially speaking, they would have to be able to go and generate the surpluses through taxation. It is true, you can't go and launch on taxation today. Because the worst thing to do is to put huge tax increases on an economy which is already slipping deep into this dark hole. So obviously you can't do it today. But even if you use the instrument that you have today, which is to go and borrow from the central bank in substantial measure, then you would end up with a situation in which you would have to, as I said, shift to a more egalitarian fiscal policy, a more egalitarian and redistributive fiscal policy, and that might be something which constrains the government, given possibly its inclinations. The other reason why, which is often quoted on why this should not be done, is the argument that if you do this, you're actually going to have foreign capital exiting from the economy, in which the bond market is going to collapse because they're going to sell their bonds and leave, etc. Now, the thing to realize is that if you look at foreign financial investors today, they are already leaving. They are leaving in droves, not just from India, from all those emerging markets to which they came and used cheap money to make lucrative investments and made their returns. And now they are cutting their losses and booking their profits and going back to the safe haven, which is the United States. And in India's case, there was something like $18 billion or more, which went out in a single month. So you're really saying that in any case, they're going. And as far as the bond market is concerned, the degree to which they had invested, because there are ceilings and they really began to take interest in bond markets more recently, there isn't too much of money out there. And stock markets in any case are collapsing. That's really the secondary market. That's paper wealth of a kind, which in any case had been inflated during this period when a large amount of capital came in. And you basically have to say they are going. And in fact, the fact that they are going actually gives you a reason to impose capital controls and try and regulate the pace at which they exit and the pace at which new capital comes in at a later stage. Because normally you cannot impose capital controls because of the fear that money will run out. But if the money anyway is running out, you just go out, do your thing nationally, but you actually try and moderate the possible adverse effects on your currency, etc., of the exit, which is in any case occurring, by using the opportunity to actually impose capital controls. So, in essence, what I'm saying is that it's not that one is that there are things like inflation and the possibility of capital exit are either anyway or really are not the essential problem in the current context. The real issue, of course, as I said, is the ability of the state to say that it's going to change the perspective on the basis of which it functioned, its economic policy generally functioned, and its fiscal policy in particular functioned during the period from the early 1990s. And it is perhaps the unwillingness to come to terms with the fact that that change would have to be made if you take the decision, which is the only decision you can take today, that you're actually holding back. And holding back is also partly because of the fact that under normal circumstances in a democracy, you would not be able to hold back in a context of this kind. You're able to hold back for two reasons. One, because of the fact of an increasing use of the crisis as a way to clamp down on any criticism or dissent, etc. But more importantly, it's a reflection of the fact that we happen to be such a deeply hierarchical society that the fact that down below there are people who are suffering in ways in which they've not experienced suffering in a very, very long time doesn't seem to matter enough to actually take the one decision, which is the only decision which can be taken in terms of financing a path out of this crisis, and which is something which not just India, but other countries, which outside India, other countries are beginning to adopt. Now, I just want to sort of tie this all up by addressing one more issue. That is that there is an argument which is gaining currency, which is essentially saying that, listen, fiscal policy is not the only way in which this can be addressed, because then you'll have to give up on the FRBM Act, you'll have to risk inflation, you'll have to risk capital flight and so on. That the money can be pulled out from somewhere else. Of course, central bank. And how can the money be pulled out? That you can use monetary policy. What does monetary policy involve? Partly you bring down interest rates. The repo rate was brought down by 0.75 of a percentage point, by 75 basis points, and from 2 to 4.40. So you're saying that you have a repo rate at 4.40. So you put money into the system such that the financial institutions which would normally provide credit, which would be the banks, the non-bank financial companies, which of course are now not providing credit because of the fact that they're sitting on large non-performing assets. They are therefore thinking twice before lending. Because the banks are thinking twice before lending, bonds which are being issued by non-bank financial companies are not being picked up by the banking system. Therefore, they don't have any money. Because they don't have any money, they have a liquidity crunch, which is going to you can have a financial crisis. But more importantly, the lending which the NBFCs used to do to the medium and small enterprises, etc., is not occurring. To the housing sector is not occurring. And this is actually is part of the reason why we had this crisis. So what you need is for the central bank to try and get credit moving to where it should move. That is, credit at a slightly reduced interest rate, mediated through the financial system, is being seen as a solution. And the way in which this is being done is in terms of, there are all these acronyms which are used. So we have the TLTRO, which is the Targeted Long-Term Repo Operation. In essence, what that means is that the central bank essentially says that, listen, you bring me paper, which is evidence of you having lent me an investment, whatever it may be, to the banks, it's saying so. And I would take that paper and give you money at 4.4% interest rate, so long, it's a targeted repo operation, so long as you take this money which I'll give you for a longer period, normally repos of 3 months, 6 months, whatever, maybe, or even a few days, or even overnight. But you will give it to you for 1 to 3 years. You take this money, but the condition is each round of this money which we give is targeted to certain sections. Of course, the first round is targeted at the corporate sector generally. And guess who got the money? A significant amount of the money went to large borrowers who are extremely profitable entities. So you essentially had a situation where Reliance picks up, we don't know exactly the rate of interest, but rumors have it that it's in the range of about 7.5% or something. So the bank is taking money at 4.4% from the central bank. It's lending at about 7.5%, a little more maybe, to Reliance. As far as Reliance is concerned, that's cheaper money than it can get currently in the market. It uses that money to maybe retire some more expensive debt that it has. The HDFC, a very successful private bank, is also one of the beneficiaries of that operation. So you're basically using monetary policy to reach money to that section, which is supposed to actually be the one which can take care of itself, which has deep enough pockets to survive not merely this crisis, but perhaps a couple more in the coming years. But you reach money there. So realizing that this is what was happening, there was a second round. And the second round was specifically meant to go to the banks to lend to medium and small non-bank financial companies in the hope that they would lend to the medium and small and medium enterprises, etc. They don't want that money. They've taken a little bit, but they don't want to take that money because they don't want to lend to these NBFCs, because they think that these NBFCs are going to get into trouble. They're going to actually default on that debt because of the fact that they're not going to be able to find borrowers. They're going to use this liquidity to just stay afloat. They wouldn't be in a position, because their business is flourishing, to pay back. So they don't want to get into it. So you're basically seeing that using monetary policy is actually an inegalitarian way of even doing a little bit. This is perhaps 1/30th of what needs to be done. But even to do that 1/30th, you do it in this extremely inegalitarian fashion. However, what have you? People are saying that, listen, this is not working. So maybe what we need is for the government, or the central bank maybe, to provide some kind of a credit guarantee. It should tell the banks, listen, not only are we going to give you this money at 4.4%, but if you lend this money, which we want you to these different sections for which we are giving tranches of finance, then we are going to actually partly guarantee that credit. If there is a default up to a certain point of time, we will actually pay you whatever is the default amount. So in essence, you're saying that you take over the risk of possible default in the private sector when you're not able to take over the risk of loss of life, livelihood, etc., which is needed by actually getting the bank to come out to actually exploit the mint in its backyard and provide the money in order to undertake these activities. Finally, there is even a suggestion which is going on to say, okay, if banks are not willing to lend to these entities, let them actually float bonds, whether they be big corporates, whether they be medium, small enterprises, and let the central bank actually buy these bonds. That is, let the central bank not be a banker to the banks, which is why it now is lending to the banks and asking them to lend on. Let it actually directly lend to these entities which need finance. Which is saying what? You won't let the central bank print money and lend to the state, to the central government, to the state governments, which are undertaking or need to undertake this battle. Instead, you're willing to pick a small component of the larger problem, which is a problem which is actually affecting the lives of a majority of your population. You're taking a little bit of it and providing them maybe with the opportunity to stay afloat. For some of them to make profits because of the fact that they're getting cheap credit. For the others, maybe to stay afloat for a certain period of time. But that's not going to be long, because if the rest of the economy is the way it is, you might get credit, but you're not going to be able to survive because you wouldn't be able to produce and sell. Therefore, the use of this attempt to actually say that we can, that these are all financial issues, these are complex financial issues which only, financial experts, you know, those from the domain of finance can understand, and ordinary mortals like you and I cannot. That to try and use that as a means of diverting attention from the need to do what needs to be done, which is to get the central and state governments to go to the central bank and to get the state to tell the central bank, we've dropped our FRBM, we're going to borrow from you, you better lend us at relatively low rates of interest, and you tell the states you can even reduce the interest rate even lower, and you give some of that money also. You give that some of that money also to the medium and small enterprises which need to be revived. You put some of that money to ring fence productive activity so that you can revive production. Of course, you use that money to be able to address health and emergency and to make the transfers required to keep people alive and at least nourished, if not, fully nourished, till such point of time as you can get out of this crisis. To use monetary policy as a possible as an excuse, as an apology, in the form of a substitute for this kind of intervention, is actually to say that you would rather promote inegalitarianism and failure rather than actually try and get success. But of course, with the requirement that that will have to be accompanied by a transition to a more egalitarian framework of economic policy in the medium and long term. I think I'll stop here and maybe take some questions.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. Thanks very much for a wonderful lecture. We have started getting questions. There are two sets of, if I do a broad classification of questions that we've got so far, there are two sets of them. One that deals with which is a majority of questions, are about how to raise resources. I think let's deal with those first. Then there are a few questions about demand, which we can deal with later. But let's first deal with these. So we have a question from Viraya Kanduri, where he's asking about why can't we demand for securities transactions tax, which can tax the finance capital and leave out the production sector and also common man. What do you think about that? Anindya Sen Gupta has asked about what do you think about diverting the money on the MP Lad scheme? What is that the right thing to do? Also, isn't it necessary to ensure that state governments get their dues of GST revenues and spend more? So there are in fact a couple of questions about GST revenue. Then Kamya and Balvinder Singh have asked about the report of IRS officers, which recommends introducing a wealth tax and a higher income tax for the super rich. What do you think about that? Particularly, the government has called it a misguided report and, said that it will affect demand later. Kamya says, but shouldn't such a taxation on the rich be linked with a higher demand in future owing to redistribution of income? Isn't that such a taxation better than bonds, loans, charity, and voluntary contributions like to the new PM CARES? Saloni has asked a question about reintroduction. Can't India reintroduce capital controls? And Malini has a question about collapse of stock market. Would that mean that the wealth held by rich is lower, and if that would affect how much we can garner through the wealth tax? So this is one set of questions about mobilize different ways in which resources could be mobilized, and what do you think about those? So, Prof?
Shall I take them first?
Yes, please.
Well, I just want to make one thing clear, that yes, we need a range of taxation. Do we need a securities transaction tax? Yes, we need a securities transaction tax that has not merely the benefits of mobilizing resources, but it also works against speculative investments, because of the fact that undertaking transactions very often in short periods would result in a situation where a certain margin would be taken over by the state. So we need that when taxation is undertaken. We need wealth taxes. I think the IRS officers have done. They are young officers. It's just amazing that they did what they did. It it is true that we are a democracy. People can actually have differences of opinion and want to debate it, but the suggestions they have made on the need to tax the super rich, the need to have a wealth tax, etc., are excellent suggestions. And of course, there can be one argument which is made that, listen, this is not the time to actually go around imposing very significant taxes, because if you do that in a situation in which you're already going into a hole, you can muddy the waters quite even more. And therefore, you need to use other instruments in the short term to address the immediate emergency, the immediate crisis. But using that other instruments might require you to do what you should have anyway been doing, which is to impose these taxes, like the wealth tax, the securities transaction tax, like the higher end taxes on the upper income ranges. What you could possibly think of doing immediately is, for example, just as much as you're thinking of postponing payments of DNS allowance for government employees, you could have just said that, listen, we gave you this tax concession in September last year to the corporates, which involved 145 thousand crore loss to the government. We are at the moment, even if you don't want to say we're withdrawing it, you can even withdraw it. But even if we don't say you want to withdraw it, we're saying, given the emergency, we are now going to actually keep that pending. This is not going to be implemented now. Please pay up those taxes which you would have otherwise paid, and you can do that, because that is basically taking something which you had already given in the middle of the pre-COVID crisis that you were in. But generally imposing very significant taxes in the middle of a recession is going to go deeper is not the best idea. You use other instruments, but with the knowledge that you're going to do it. And one of the reasons I'm arguing is, just as much as you want to you want to charge sheet IRS officers who are making completely sensible suggestions, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, they're making completely sensible and some things which possibly would have to be adopted. Instead of charge sheeting them, you say that, okay, we can't do this just now, and we need to have a larger consultation on this, but we thank you for having thought of this. It shows a commitment. It shows a commitment of these revenue service officers to actually generate revenues to deal with the emergency, and of course to deal with the requirements of finance in the medium and long term as well. So I think one of the statements which was reported in the press, which ostensibly came from some spokesperson in finance or elsewhere, was that, thank God they're closed, because the report was put out on Twitter in the evening after the markets were closed, and they said, oh, thank God the markets were closed, because their worry is only that capital will run away. But this capital is anyway running away, and in any case, that's not the issue. You can basically say, that would, tomorrow you would say that if somebody writes an article in a newspaper, or a survey is done which comes up with the result that, listen, you need to increase wealth taxes, that you wouldn't allow that to be released, because that can have an adverse effect. Just because these people belong to the revenue services doesn't make them state policy. And in fact, they said that this is not state policy, this is our suggestion to the state. So I think it reflects this unwillingness to come to terms with the magnitude of the crisis, other than for the imposition of a lockdown, both in practice as well as in terms of identifying the instruments to go out dealing with it, even in a context in which, barring some, ex-governors of the Reserve Bank of India and so on, where a range of people who otherwise hold conservative opinions, even Rakesh Mohan, Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, has come out quite openly and said that, listen, you have to go and borrow from the central bank. Central bank has to do this, not as a long-term policy, but immediately you please print money and put it out into the system. So the unwillingness to do this, as I said, reflects the burden of ideology, but more importantly, the belief that economic policy is not the way in which you're going to get support and national support. And of course, that it's such a hierarchical society that it somehow doesn't seem to matter that such a large section is as adversely affected as it is. Capital controls are stages, but beginning to impose them will see the exit of capital. Capital is anyway exiting, so you might as well do it now and get yourself the benefit of being able to protect yourself in the medium term, rather than actually have to face with a similar kind of exit sometime in the future as well. MP lads, yeah, of course, but the point is, the MP lads' money, it shows the complete, lack of understanding of the gravity of the situation, perhaps, or the refusal to see the gravity of the situation. I should say, how could you lack the ability to understand? Which is that, I mean, that money could have been used as part of the effort to address the emergency, the crisis. But the point is, in any case, it's small money relative to what is required. It's peanuts. So just to say that we're going to save that money, and what are you doing with that money? What is the center doing with whatever money it has in a way in which we can actually say that, oh, this it has done, which has had the following effects, other than, of course, the lockdown. So I don't know. I don't know what drives this kind of an understanding. And finally, on GST, of course, the states have to be compensated for the loss of GST revenues, which means that lots more will have to be given to them if you're going to ensure that they're going to get their 14% in this financial year, because 14% increase, because they're not going to be anywhere. They're going to have, they're going to have a negative, huge negative as far as their GST revenues is concerned. You'll have to compensate them for that, pay them in time such that they have that money. But more important, that's rightfully theirs. So besides the transfers that you need to make in addition, you have to give them their rightful money. What is becoming clear, not because of this crisis, but because of the experience of the last close to 3 years, is that advised as a strategy and policy. It is extremely bad for the states, and therefore, I think we, besides immediately giving up on FRBM and changing our attitude towards the way in which we deal with fiscal policy, etc., and rethinking taxation in the medium term, we'll have to, as part of that, rethink GST as well. I think we possibly need to. There are other countries which gave it up, and maybe India should find ways of transiting to a system which actually is at the least revenue neutral relative to the past, even if it doesn't give us more revenue, but not this thing, which is actually giving you less revenue than the rate at which revenue should be growing if you didn't have it. I think I've dealt with most of them. Because?
Yes. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. There are a few more questions on the same thread, let's say, which maybe we should deal with. Rana Mitra has asked, don't you think that the overall monetary stance announced recently is more accommodative for NBFCs than for cooperative banks and RRBs who are financing direct agricultural lending much better? In this sort of similar, in the context of rural credit, there's also a question from Tanaya asking, non-institutional financial agencies have monopoly in the rural leading the poor into indebtedness and land alienation. What revisions as policy inputs can you suggest for this problem? That is of the informal lending in rural areas, that is. Then Archana Mangalagiri has asked the question, would you suggest that the foreign exchange reserves be used for extending support to the government? Jayashankar asks, liquidity infusion comes from an absolutely wrong diagnosis. Do you agree that solvency and lack of trust need to be addressed via fiscal measures from the sovereign? Ishan Singla has asked, what do you think of the suggestion to repurpose funds allocated to the Central Vista project? Peter D'Souza wants you to explain the role of federalism in spending. Yeah? Do you want to take this?
Okay. Yeah. The question with regard to segments of the financial sector which actually provide credit to to small and medium enterprises, to agriculturists, or not agriculturists, but let's say non-formal sector activities in rural areas and semi-urban areas, etc. It's true. I mean, we don't have a situation where the central bank is saying that, listen, we'll give banks money if they target lending to the regional rural banks or the so-called but as part of the NBFC's TLTRO, the mutual fund institution, the microfinance institutions are part of it. So they are trying to accommodate the microfinance institutions because of the fact that microfinance institutions are part of, in some sense, the post-liberalization financial structure, what was modeled as a post-liberalization financial structure, with some of them, in fact, even resorting to securitization, etc., in substantial measure, handing over those securities to the banking system in lieu of priority sector credit. And to the extent that they have a shortfall in priority sector credit, part of it can be met by actually buying up securitized assets from the microfinance institutions. So if you leave out the microfinance institutions, these other segments are not really being addressed as of now. Of course, there's no way the non-formal financial lending, infrastructure is going to be supported by money from the central bank. But basically, the way I see it is that, it's necessary to try and reach formal credit, and in that, to the extent that the cooperative banks and the rural, regional rural banks, etc., can play a role. They're more active in some states than in other states, particularly the cooperatives. We should think of mechanisms by which they are provided with liquidity as well, to the extent. But I do think that in the medium term, two things would become important. One is, as I said, that there has to be some kind of a way of ensuring that the interest rate at which credit can be provided by whichever institution, whether it is the banking system, whether it's RRBs, whether it is which are part of the banking system in part, whether it be the cooperative banks and so on, that there has to be a way in which, given their transaction costs, given the capital cost at which they're getting their money from the central bank or elsewhere, that the interest rate at which lending occurs must be an interest rate which is reasonable relative to the returns from activities which can occur in the revival is only going to begin to happen as and when it begins to happen. The other thing I would think is that a part of the things which might have to be done in order to address this crisis as we go along would be to actually have debt relief. And I'm not talking just of generalized loan waivers and so on, but debt relief in terms of debt relief commissions, actually looking at the fact that this kind of a situation would have pushed a lot of small players into debt, including debt with informal money lenders. And there must be some institution, some special purpose vehicle provided with capital from the amount of money which is going to be spent to be able to fund the activities of this kind of a debt relief commission, because there is going to be an accumulation of debt at extremely high interest rates, which would be completely damaging in the medium term. So we need to think of that as well, besides thinking of reaching credit through institutions which do lend to these kinds of smaller entities, because most institutions don't. In fact, many small entities actually don't even rely on borrowing. They use funds from family and their own resources, etc., and therefore remain extremely small activities. Can we use the foreign reserves? I would say, what is the need to use the foreign reserves? Because if you use foreign reserves, then we should be able to generate, because unlike a country like China, where a large part of the foreign reserves are actually earned foreign reserves, they come from the fact that not merely does China, of course, receive a lot amount of capital coming from abroad in the form of direct investment and more recently even portfolio investment, but it also is because of the fact, or significantly because of the fact, that China is a country which, for a significant period of time, has earned more foreign exchange from the exports of goods and services than it has spent on the imports of goods and services. So accumulated current account surpluses also are part of the reserves. So there are earned reserves. Compared to that, a country like India, for example, our foreign reserves are all borrowed. They come as a result. We run consistent current account deficits. We spend more foreign exchange than we earn, including remittances, such that we run current account deficits. So a part of the money which is coming into the country goes to finance those deficits. And then we get so much more coming into our stock markets and bond markets that we actually, actually put this, build up these foreign exchange reserves. And if we use that up, these liabilities which we'll have to, in some sense, service at some point of time. We'll have to not merely have the money to do it, but we'll have to transform that into foreign exchange. So I would say that, well, use a part of your foreign exchange to the extent that there is a certain amount of the activity which you'll have to undertake, which necessarily will have to be imported from abroad. But try and revive activity based on domestic financing, such that you can produce the domestic real resources required to sustain supply, generate the demand for employment, and then feed this recovery. Will the collapse in the stock market affect wealth? Yes, it would affect wealth, but I'm sure that independent of that, there would be enough wealth, both in the form of paper wealth as well as in the form of real assets which underlie the wealth position of some of the richest, including some of the richest individuals in the country. We also need an inheritance tax, which we have to think about quite seriously. So I do think that there is considerable possibility, that is, the level of non-use of the opportunities to tax